Do you trust the media? Well, if you don't, then you're not alone, because a growing number of Australians seem to distrust the media, at least according to a 2024 digital news report conducted by the University of Canberra. This was essentially a survey of around 2,000 Australians about their thoughts about various media outlets and their attitude toward the media. They found that only 40% of people actually trust the media, down from 43% in 2023. By contrast, 33% of people say they specifically distrust the media. This leaves 27% of people who neither distrust nor trust the media per se. Now, one might presume that this latter category, the 27% of people that neither trust nor distrust the media, are skeptical toward media reports. They won't blindly follow what the media says, but they won't necessarily assume the media is lying by default. Rather, they will verify what they are being told, which is perhaps a lesser degree of distrust of the media. This means that only a minority of people are actually going to outright believe what the media is saying. And the amount of trust has been decreasing, and the amount of distrust has been increasing. People are either more prone to verify what the media is saying, or they're more prone to assume that the media is misleading them. Now, unsurprisingly, people are more willing to trust their own preferred news source than they are the news in general. Now, of course, Australia is about middle of the road when it comes to media trust, but Australians do trust the media more than people in the UK or in the US. But they trust the media less than people in Germany, Denmark, or Finland, for example. Now, this notwithstanding, the more overtly biased the media becomes, and the more disingenuous it is about that bias, gaslighting people about whether the bias even exists, well, one would expect that trust to fall even further. And we can see some interesting splits by demographics that might support some of that assumption. Now, there's some interesting splits here. Women seem to trust the news less than men, with only 37% of women trusting the news compared with 44% of men. Trust in the news, ironically, increases with formal education. That is, people who are supposedly more educated seem to be less discerning about the news. This is a little bit disquieting, because you would think education is supposed to instill in people an idea of critical thinking, of keeping a healthy degree of skepticism toward reporting, of not just blindly believing whatever you are told. However, this doesn't seem to be the case, at least according to the demographic splits here, and it might in fact be that so-called formal education is encouraging blind adherence to an orthodoxy rather than critical thinking. Now, the converse is the case if we look at distrust. Women distrust the news more than men, with 34% of women distrusting the news compared to 32% of men. Higher education groups appear to distrust the news less than those in median levels of education, 30% to 38%. High-income earners, strangely, distrust the news less than low-income earners, but the differences are relatively marginal at 34% to 33%. Now, people in regional areas, rather unsurprisingly, trust the news much less than those in cities, with only 37% of people in regional areas trusting the news, compared with 42% in the city. Conversely, 35% of people in regional areas actively distrust the news, compared with only 32% in cities. Now, this perhaps is not terribly surprising, given that much of the news production occurs in the city, and is dominated by inner-city locations, and this has been increasing over time as newsrooms start to consolidate, and as regional rooms start to get decreased. It appears that regional locations don't seem to trust the news very much. Now, there are also some interesting splits by news source. People who read the old-fashioned print media are more likely to trust the news. This has increased over time to 57% of print media readers trusting the news. However, one might wonder about causality here. For example, if someone distrusts the print media, they would simply stop reading it and perhaps leave the news alone, which means that they are no longer a print media reader. Rather, only the people who were perhaps predisposed to trust the news would actually go out and buy a print newspaper. Therefore, the causality isn't necessarily clear-cut. Now, only 49% of television news watchers trust the media. This then dramatically falls off to 41% of online news readers, and 37% of radio news listeners. And only 31% of social media news consumers trust the news. Now, this is very, very unsurprising to my mind, because often people who are perhaps relying on social media are looking for experts on social media and have soured on the biased mainstream sources. Now, there appears to be a bipartisan distrust, or lack of trust, in the news. Only 40% of left-wing and 40% of right-wing people trust the news. Neither side seems to think the news gets it quite right. Now, quite how the left and right-wing are defined here is a little bit open to question. Right now, the term right-wing has become so misused and so widely used as to be a little bit meaningless. It seems to encompass both libertarians and fascists, two rather different groups. Now, if we look at trust by news source, oddly, the ABC is trusted by 64% of people, but this has fallen a little bit over time, down 2 percentage points. But 19% of people actively distrust the news. I find this a little bit surprising because I would have thought the ABC would score rather lower. And personally, I regard the ABC as rather unreliable, as signified by the number of defamation lawsuits the ABC has been hit with. However, that's my personal opinion. Maybe different people have different views on this, as is clear from the survey. Now, in terms of newspapers, the AFR, or Australian Financial Review, scored the highest at 54%, followed by the Australian and the Guardian tying at 50%. Then you've got the Age and SMH, both at 48%. Most of these news sources are seemingly relatively similar in terms of trust levels. Now, concerns about so-called misinformation also apparently continue to grow. 75% of people claim to be concerned about misinformation, so to speak, compared with only 8% that are not concerned. However, it begs the question of what exactly is misinformation, according to this survey. One might wonder, for example, whether all people who are concerned about misinformation also would recommend similar remedies. For example, some people like Anthony Albanese would seemingly want to go and suppress misinformation. Some people, by contrast, would seemingly just want that misinformation called out and challenged. Furthermore, one wonders exactly what is defined as misinformation. For example, I'm concerned about misinformation on the ABC in the form of bias that I personally believe the ABC has. But people who trust the ABC presumably think that it is reliable, and are concerned with suppressing information on Sky News as an example. Therefore, it seems that what counts as misinformation might vary between people, and the word misinformation has been so overused that it has become completely meaningless at this point. The survey also has some other interesting findings, and these are worth perusing. I'll link to it in the description below, but I've attempted to extract the highlights here. In short, trust in media is down. Distrust in media is up. This is not surprising, since media bias appears to be increasing, along with gaslighting about that very same bias, which ironically makes trust in the media even worse when people realize that the wool is being pulled over their eyes. But let me know your thoughts about media bias and whether the media is trustworthy at all in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear what you think.